Hello and welcome back to another installment on my series about the upcoming Russian summer offensive, where I give a couple of scenarios as to how it will go. In my previous video, Operation Poseidon's Fist, I covered the southern scenario for what could happen. It is summer, where the first step is the Russian capture of the Donetsk region, the second step is an assault towards Dnipro and Zaporizhia, and the third one is towards Odessa or towards Kiev, depending on the course of each of the former stages. But make sure to check it out if you haven't, and if you have, you'll get exactly what I say. This video will be focusing on the scenario for the whole front line. The former episode was on the southern front, this one will be on the whole front, the next will be on the eastern, and then we have the northern. For this one, we'll be looking at what happens in this summer if the Russian decision in the command headquarters of the Russian army is to simply take control over all of Ukraine, and in that scenario the Russians would be attacking from the whole front line, spanning from the western borders of Belarus and all the way down south to the Kherson region. So the whole borderline between Russia, Belarus and Ukraine, going through the front line as well as the national borders. In this scenario, based on the calculations in my previous video, the Russians would have 700,000 soldiers by the time summer kicks in, and the Ukrainians would, in this scenario, considering the whole territory of Ukraine would be involved, also have 700,000 soldiers in the fight. This means that it will be a 1-to-1 scenario where the Russians and the Ukrainians have an equal amount of soldiers. However, when it comes to materials and vehicles, the Russians have a significant advantage. Now, in the scenario where the Russians take this decision, Belarus would also be drawn into the fight. In this scenario, it could be one of two ways. Either Belarus itself enters the war with the Russians, or the Russians will use the territory of Belarus yet again to launch offensive operations. Either way, if it's one or the other, the Ukrainians, the West, and everyone in the world would know that the Russians were planning something like this and will see the movement of troops. The main reason for that is there's a lot of NGOs situated in Belarus monitoring the movement of troops, both of Russian origin, the Wagner soldiers, as well as Belarusian military within the country. This means that the first few trains entering into Belarus, whether it be equipment or soldiers, these NGOs would report it to the public. I've been following one of those NGOs which has been monitoring all troop movement within Belarus since 24th of February, where they're looking out for the Belarusian training, movement of troops, movement of material, as well as when Wagner moved to Belarus, in addition to the movement of Russian soldiers and material in and out of the country. Examples of such monitoring is the movement of Wagner troops at the start. A couple tens of thousands of soldiers entered Belarus. At this point, only a few thousand remain, about 3,000 soldiers. The rest have left the country. The same with the Russian soldiers. About 5,000 Russian soldiers are within Belarus. This adds up to about 8,000 foreign soldiers. At the same time, the Russians and the Wagnerian soldiers have been training Belarusian soldiers within Belarus. This training has taken place since April of 2022. This means that this has now been ongoing for almost 2 years. This is plenty of time to train a massive army. There's no public or official information. It is purely open source intelligence, monitoring as well as official announcements. But based on the information that the Russians and the Wagnerians have been training soldiers in Belarus for almost 2 years now, and the average time of a soldier finishing training within Russia based on the mobilization is about 3 months. With that information, we can say that they have done about 8 cycles since the start of the war, with the 8th one finishing this summer. Based on that information and during some research I've done on the training basis of Belarus, they have the capacity to train about 30,000 soldiers in one cycle. This would add up to 240,000 soldiers. If we assume that all of those are now combat ready based on the training, and that 240,000 soldiers have been trained, and the Belarusian army starts and joins the Russian army in a invasion of Ukraine, similar to at the very start of the war, but this time with the participation of the Belarusian army. The Belarusians would have 200 additional soldiers to support the Russians. This would add the Russian number up to 900,000. But this is unlikely to happen. The main reason for that is that there is a fear in Russia and Belarus that if the Russians are starting to reach a place where they launch a massive offensive, and that massive offensive is seeing success, NATO countries would participate in the war on Ukraine's side. Due to that, the Belarusian army is unlikely to participate in such a massive offensive and will instead be positioned on the western borders of Belarus, both towards the Baltics as well as Poland, to secure their own borders, as well as in a southern direction to prevent a Ukrainian counterattack. This, however, does not mean that the Russians cannot launch their own troops through the territory of Belarus, either towards Lviv, to cut off physical roads from Western aid to Ukraine, or towards Kiev, both from the Chernihiv and Chernobyl directions, to repeat the offensive on Kiev, which happened on February 2022. So with this information, we can see that there is a possibility that the Russians will attack through Belarus, as Belarus has secured their own flanks with the training that has happened over the past 2 years. Now, with that out of the way, we can take a look at the eastern and southern parts before we move on to the scenario itself. The eastern parts, the Russians have a lot of their own soldiers. Now, there is 2 ways that they can go about this. The first one is that there's reports that a lot of the trained Russian soldiers are stationed in Belgorod and Kursk during their training and prior to their deployment. Based on this information, we can see that the Russians do have reserves besides the 600,000 that are committed to the war itself. And on top of that, there is new ones being trained every day. This is why the number will add up to 700,000 by the summer, despite the losses that the Russians are suffering in the battles. So with this, we can see the Russians do have soldiers available besides the ones already committed to the fighting. There is no official numbers besides the fact that the Russians are planning on increasing the size of their army to 1.5 million by the end of 2025. However, that is still more than a year away. However, what we do have of information is that they plan by the end of 2024 to have 745,000 contract servicemen. This on top of the 300,000 mobilized that adds up to 1,050,000 soldiers. We currently have 600,000 in Ukraine of the Russian side. That adds up to 600,000. And at the current rate, the Russians will increase the army size by the end of the year by 200,000. That adds up to 800,000. That means that 250,000 would have to appear out of thin air, or they are already there, just not inside of Ukraine. So with this shadow number, which is 250,000, we can assume that the Russians likely have that amount on the eastern border. In this scenario, that the Russians plan on a massive offensive across the whole front line. In this scenario, the Russians would likely use this force of 250,000 soldiers outside of Ukraine, plus the additional 100,000 soldiers, which will be prepared by the summer. This adds up to 350,000 soldiers outside of Ukraine. 350,000 soldiers means that they can prepare 150,000 through Belarus and 200,000 on the eastern border. This would be separated into 100,000 on Kharkiv and 100,000 here between Sumy and Chernihiv. As for the 150,000, they would likely be concentrated towards Kiev, about 50,000, and 100,000 towards Lviv. This would be spread across the whole front line, and the Ukrainians would have to respond by sending their troops across the whole front line. Now, there are multiple ways the Ukrainians can respond to this, but the main one would be to simply try and hold everywhere without losing any of the territories, because the Russians would simply be outmanning them to such a severe degree that even if they wanted to concentrate their forces in one area to deal with one at a time, they could risk losing the other areas. And in this scenario, the Ukrainians would likely give up the eastern parts of the Dnieper River in a simple cost-benefit analysis. Taking a look at it, the Dnieper River can function as a defensive line between the Russian and Ukrainian forces, as the Russians do not have any presence on the western bank. At the same time, we see that the Russians have a significant force on the eastern bank. if they have the 600,000 in the south and 200,000 additional entering from the east, that would add up to 800,000, with only 150,000 on the western parts. If the Russians are to focus all of their forces in the east, the Ukrainians would then, if they withdraw beyond the Dnieper River, have to run away from the front and withdraw into the western bank. This would be a very risky maneuver, especially if the Russians plan on bombing the bridges across the Dnieper River. In that scenario, they have to make makeshift bridges, pontoon bridges, and try to cross over that way. Either way, it will be catastrophic, and the Ukrainians would likely choose instead to defend and delay the Russian army as much as possible, and buy time for operations in the west. Operations in the west will be much more important, because it will be situated around the defense of Kiev and Lviv. These two cities are both extremely important. Kiev is the political leadership as well as the command of the military is situated in and around Kiev, and with that, the whole head of the Ukrainian defense is there. While Lviv is the heart of all supplies coming from the west, if Lviv is taken by the Russians, then the Ukrainians would essentially receive no additional support from the west without the western countries fighting inside of Ukraine. Therefore, the Ukrainians would focus on the defense here. That would be their main priority. Even losing the whole east of the Dnieper River would mean less than losing either of these two cities, much less losing both of them. The majority of the Ukrainian forces and attention will be focused around the defense in the north. This, however, taking this into account, would mean that the Russians could simply use the north as a distraction. Sending troops to Belarus would force the Ukrainians to redirect a lot of their soldiers to the defense of Kiev and Lviv. So simply by putting Russian soldiers inside the country, the Ukrainians would redirect their own forces to the north. If they then do not plan on attacking but simply just relocate their troops there, the Ukrainians would be leaving other areas less defended, whether it be the northeastern parts, eastern parts, or even the front line or the Dnieper River, less defended. This means that if the Russians make a massive push in one of these directions, they would likely see much more success than not putting any troops in Belarus in the first place. They could do this in many ways. They could simply make decoys, like the British did in World War II, where they faked where they would land during the D-Day landings by creating a fake army and placing it on the eastern coasts of the United Kingdom instead of the southern ones, which made the Germans believe that it was going to be happening in Germany or the Netherlands instead of France. Instead, what we're seeing here is if the Russians simply created a fake army in Belarus, or they could even just send conscripts or anything that isn't their main army to Belarus, which would redirect Ukrainian forces to the north, and they would take advantage of that to launch their attacks in the east or in the south. It is clear that the Russians prioritize capturing cities like Kharkiv and Odessa over cities like Kiev and Lviv in the western parts of Ukraine. The supplies in Ukraine mainly goes through the cities of Kiev as well as Kremenchuk, Dnipro, and Zaporizhia across the Dnieper River. The ones going through Kiev and Kremenchuk all go through Poltava and Kharkiv, while the ones in the south go through Dnipro and Zaporizhia to then go through Pokrovsk in the Donetsk region. This means that if the Russians simply attack here west or in the area between Kharkiv and Sumy, westwards towards Dnieper River, they could cut off all the Ukrainian supply lines going through Kiev in the north. While if they at the same time launch an attack towards Pokrovsk in the south, they would have cut off all supplies to the Donetsk and Kharkiv regions. So in the scenario that the Russians launch this operation as a full front assault across the whole front line, the Russians will likely relocate soldiers to Belarus to relocate Ukrainian soldiers to the northern front. Then they will launch an attack here in between Kharkiv and Sumy, likely towards the cities as well, relocating a massive force here in the center, combining this with an assault launching either towards Zaporizhia in the south, towards Pokrovsk in the Donetsk region, down from the Belgorod direction towards the south of Kharkiv, towards the Slaviansk, Kramatorsk, Konstantinivka area, and through to the Dnipro area. Either way, the Russians will likely launch massive assaults in the east, and leave the north as a distraction and attack everywhere across the front line here to the east, and use this opportunity to spread the Ukrainian army thinly. If they manage to break through and cut off a large portion of the Ukrainian army, they'll likely use that as an opportunity to cross over. If an operational encirclement of the Ukrainian army fails, they'll likely look to bomb all of the bridges across the Dnieper River. If the Russians are looking to gain control or succeed in such an operation, they'd need to gain complete air supremacy over eastern Ukraine, and especially in the south by the Dnieper River if they ever want to cross over. Before that, we'll likely see a massive air raid by the Russians against the Ukrainian air defense prior to such an operation. To identify this operation over all other operations, it will likely be that the Russians will move portions of their army to Belarus. If Russians are moving their units north, it is likely due to this operation taking place. If the Russians do not use their or move their units to the north, then this will not take place. To get a final overview over this scenario, it will likely be that the Russians, step 1, go to Belarus with a portion of the army or creating a fake army. This is to redirect Ukrainian soldiers to the north. Step 2 would be launching an assault north of Kharkiv, south of Sumy, in the direction of Poltava and Kremenchuk towards the Dnieper direction. The third step would be to follow that up with attacks towards Pokrovsk or Zaporizhia in the south, and in the northern direction south of Kharkiv towards the Dnipro city itself. So in this scenario, the main force will be in the east, while there is going to be a lot of distractions in the north and possibly an entry into the direction of Chernihiv to prevent the Ukrainians from sending reinforcements to these other areas when nothing happens in the direction of Belarus. At the same time, we'll have the third step, which would be an operation towards the south of Ukraine in the direction of Odessa. The southern direction is one that the Russians have a huge interest in, and that is due to their infatuation with the city of Odessa. The Russians plan on getting control over Odessa, and that is something that is clear both in their official statements and in the actions that they are taking during this war. To gain control over Odessa, the Russians would need to cross the Dnieper River. Their first goal would be to complete stage 2. If that goes well, they will use that to cross over towards Kryvyi Rih and push through the Ukrainian fortifications in Kryvyi Rih and Mykolaiv before moving to Odessa. If that does not go well, if the stage 2 does not go well, they will likely look to cross over the Dnieper River with their own makeshift bridges, pontoon bridges, and simply naval assaults, similar to how the Ukrainians have been attempting to go through the Dnieper River. The main part of this operation would be to simply focus their attention on the eastern parts, and then instead of going through the Dnieper River in case that they are facing difficulties doing so, gain control over all of eastern Ukraine and start pressuring Kiev. If the eastern Ukraine or everything east of the Dnieper River falls into Russian hands, they'll be in a position where they can launch a massive offensive through Belarus to avoid the Dnieper River completely and simply take Odessa by capturing all of Ukraine, or going through towards Kiev to force a ceasefire and treaty where they can take Odessa through the peace deal. And that is all for this scenario. This is the full front scenario. In the future, you'll be seeing a eastern scenario and a northern scenario before we move on to talk about the possibility of war between NATO and Russia, where I'll give my 2 cents as to whether or not believe that is possible, and if it is possible, how likely it will happen. But that'll be it for this video. Thank you all for watching and have a great day.